Our webinar is entitled Earthworms and Acoustics, and we've got two speakers with us. So the first speaker is Dr. Jackie Stroud, and Jackie's a relatively new and very welcome member of the Warwick Crop Centre team, and her expertise is in earthworms. And then following Jackie, Carlos Abrahams will speak, and Carlos Abrahams is from Baker Consultants, and Baker Consultants have been awarded a DEFRA grant as part of the Farming Innovation Programme, and Baker Consultants, Carlos and Jackie are working together on this project that they're going to describe about earthworms and acoustics. So just a few sort of housekeeping things. So please turn off your camera and mute your microphone when you're not speaking, just so we don't overload the system. Please be aware we'll be recording the session and it'll be available later as a video. For those who collect them, I've applied for basis points for this, and the next webinar will be on the 24th of April at the same time, and it'll be Mark Ramsden from RSK ADAS talking about the IPM, the EU project that they've been part of, the IPM Decisions project, and he'll focus on work for horticultural crops. So in terms of questions, we'll take questions at the end of each of the presentations, but feel free to type questions in the chat as we go along. So I'll hand over to you now, Jackie. That's okay.
Okay, yeah, I'll share my screen. Today I'm talking about earthworm acoustics and biology, and I suppose the first question that you might have is can we actually hear earthworms? And a way of sort of looking at this is by putting earthworms in like a amount of soil. This is equivalent to a spadeful of soil, so it's a 20 by 20 centimetre pot with good soundproofing around the edges. And these are all the different sensors that people have been publishing with. So some are geophones, some are different types of waveguides, which can be copper or stainless steel. And I put some earthworms in, left them overnight, and I can show you the sort of spectrogram that we get. And so what you're looking at here, on the side we've got the frequency, and the bottom we've got time, and all these little sort of spikes are sort of the noises that earthworms are making as they're burrowing through the soil. And I can try and play the sound file. Now this can be a bit challenging because everyone has their different settings on their computers, so you can be deafened or you may not hear it at all. So what I've done is I'll just turn my sound up. We tried this earlier and it wasn't perfect, so I'll just turn my thing up a bit higher. And from current slide. So adjust your sound settings accordingly. I'll start off at 50% and move it up, but you might be able to hear them. Okay. And it's quite a quiet sound. You might have been able to hear some of the crackling there with the noises. And then, of course, so you can hear earthworms. It's possible to measure them. You could then go out to the field and put these sensors into the soil. And for example, here, a bit of soundproofing over the top, just testing different types. And end up with all sorts of different shapes of spectrograms. So again, the sort of frequency and time on the bottom. And I'll talk a little bit about what these different sounds you might hear as you go along. But you would expect perhaps a diversity of sounds in the soil system, because soil biodiversity really is immense. It's one of the most biodiverse ecosystems that we have, and a range of sort of soil animals live there. You've got things you might recognise like earthworms, things with lots of legs, and also things that you can't see that perhaps don't make noises that we can hear. And soil is really important because 59% of known species depend on soil for their survival. So that means there are a lot of interactions with the soil. So So there are some animals, for example, butterflies, you wouldn't associate with soil, but their sort of larvae stage is actually within the soil environment, and those larvae may make sounds. So it's actually incredibly biodiverse, perhaps more broadly than you've considered before. And there are so how on earth do we approach this? Well, one way is to prioritize what we're looking at. And a good starting point is to look at ecosystem engineers. And these would be the ants, the earthworms, and the termites. And they're called ecosystem engineers because of their roles in shaping the soil habitat for the other organisms that live in it. Their role is just much bigger than other ones. Then we've got subordinate animals, which we tend to classify depending on whether they help us grow food or whether they compete with things that we want to eat. So you've got beneficials broadly, carabid beetles as biocontrol agents. They tend to eat things like slugs, and ground nesting bees, which are associated with pollination, versus pests, which are species specific. So cereal beetles competing, trying to feed on cereals, or brown soil slugs, again, similarly feeding on food plants. And then thirdly, we have sort of general biodiversity, and that can be centipedes, millipedes, insect larvae and pupae, that side of things. So one way of starting when you sort of think about the soil and sound-making animals is think about what is it that we should probably be able to hear, and then the other layers that would be interested to add on. And the types of sounds they make can be quite easily categorized into non-deliberate sounds. So like the first recording, earthworm burrowing, for example, just locomotion noises, and then deliberate sounds. And this tends to be made by the insect group, particularly ants and beetles. And why on earth would non-deliberate sounds be significant? Why we want to measure them? It's because there are these sort of curious evolutionary couplings that there are a number of earthworm feeding birds that seem to use audio cues to help detect their earthworm prey. So birds can hear it, suggesting that if we can develop our technologies and our sensitivities, we may also be able to hear earthworm burrowing in a similar way. And it could tell us a little bit about the environment and where earthworms are. So deliberate sound making. Now this is quite a loud file. I'll turn it down a bit. And perhaps you can tell me if you can hear it or not hear it, but I'll turn it to 50% so you're not deafened. And these are some beetle larvae. And if you watch carefully, you can see sort of actions that they're making. So I hope that sound file was loud enough for you to be able to hear. But as you can see, the animal was rubbing its body parts together. That's called stridulating, and it was making a noise. And it's actually found that this behaviour, if you compare different species of larvae, can make species-specific noises. Obviously, they're rubbing their specific body parts and anatomy together. And an example of what this might sound like is a different sound. I'll play now. It should be. So it's quite exciting that there are species-specific sounds that can be associated with beetle larvae, and it's a phase of soil animal life that we don't know heaps about because they live in the soil, and so they're quite hard to measure. And in terms of deliberate sound making, stridulation is one of the most common mechanisms. So it's rubbing body parts together, and ants can do this, and beetles are one of the most common species which do this and to make sounds. And then a second very common sound you're likely to hear in the soil is a percussion sound. So that's where they're tapping and drumming the substrate. And so the difference is sort of like this sort of difference versus, tapping. And that's it's often used as an alarm mechanism, and you can see very different patterns in that, in what the sounds might look like on your spectrogram. So it can be this area versus a much more pulsed event as you go along. So you can get a sort of feel that there are all sorts of different sounds in the soil, and different soil animals make them, particularly the insect group. So the next sort of key question is, well, how soon do they make noises? You know, is it just when they're adults, or is it across the life stage? And ants, also a good ecosystem engineer example. Research, this was digging up an ant's nest in Wallingford, which is in Oxfordshire, and looking at the sounds made by queens versus workers versus pupae. And you can see that even the brown pupae stage were able to emit sounds which the workers were responding to, and the workers made a different sound to that of the queens of this species. And in terms of the sounds, sort of short length and these sorts of frequencies and intensities. So it's measurable, and we can measure and hear these sounds with the instruments that we have so far. And you know, this all seems quite encouraging. We've got this ability to hear the noises, and we've got different and you may be able to link them to species, which is quite exciting. And then, of course, it's slightly more complicated than that. And I just wanted to give you a really nice example of acoustic mimicry. So there's this parasitic butterfly, which mimics the sound made by queen ants and is looked after by worker ants at the expense of those worker ants' brood. It's a social parasite. And so although you might be hearing sounds and linking them perhaps to this species of ant, ants are very susceptible to social parasites. There are examples across many different larvae, from fly larvae, beetle larvae, and other butterfly larvae, and can form mutualisms and be social parasites with ant species, and use acoustic signals to influence the behaviour of worker ants. So completely different species can make signals in combination with chemical signaling that influences the behaviours of workers, and sometimes at their own expense. So it's really quite interesting that you get these patterns, but it also shows how important these evolutionary couplings that we're seeing, for example, the predator-prey or these social parasites, that we probably haven't fully recognised the amount of sounds that are made in the soil play such a fundamental role in shaping a lot of the behaviours, some of the behaviours, and the habitat environment. And just sort of going back to those field sounds, hopefully you might be able to hear them. They're quite quiet, but it's up. So this is just in a box, and you might be able to recognise some of them. So I'll play this one. So that's that sort of signature. And there's this one.
Jackie, it's Rosemary. I would turn it up as high as you can at your end, because
I will see what I can do. Is it really quiet still? It is on maximum volume, but you can see the spectrograms, and I don't think there's anything I can do volume my end. But if you have a headphone, you might be able to hear these things. That's it on current slide. So what you were hearing here would just have been a wind gust noise if you couldn't hear it. This one here was sirens, and this one here was, as you can imagine, a sort of clicking sound from something biological in the soil. So you can see that from the spectrograms. I'm sorry if you can't hear it. It's a challenge of trying to share sound files across the internet. Carlos will probably be able to do a better job than me. But what it means, you can categorize the different noises in the environment. So we've got the wind gusts here, to geophysical, which can mask some of the biological sounds. We have human produced sounds, for example, sirens, and you get the biological sounds. And so by able to categorize the sounds, you can either use that to help inform what you're measuring in terms of denoising the sound files, or avoiding areas of the sound files where you've got this, which would mask biological noises. So when we're recording sounds, it captures everything, but it is possible to separate and identify the biological sounds even with this sort of complexity. And a nice way of approaching acoustics is looking at experimental field trials, because there's replication opportunities to do things, for example, paired sampling. And for example, if you record the same plots at the same time, you've got the same wind noise, for example, the same human produced sounds. So you've kind of taken that out as a variable, and then you can compare the different plots. And this was on a fallow area. It's been fallowed for 50 years. And again, if you know what to look for on the spectrograms, there's not a lot of spikes here. It's not particularly interesting compared to a grass field plot where you see lots of interesting little spikes as you go. So lots of sound there, lots of biological sounds there. And what I was using here was a geophone. And it's just like a spike in the soil. It's minimum soil disturbance to be able to capture these sort of recordings. And when you compare that against our traditional techniques, for example, looking for earthworms, where I'm digging great lumps of the soil, which causes disturbance, it takes quite a long time to do. The pit size is generally 20 by 20 by 20, so a spadeful, but people do anything from 5 centimeters all the way down to 30. Hand sorting on the mat, you can spend 5 minutes to an hour per pit. And in terms of the design, you might want to do 5 to 20 soil pits for fields. So it's incredibly laborious just to be able to capture information about earthworms and missing out on all those other species and interactions that might be in the soil. And the reason why sort of focusing on earthworms, I just thought I'd that without the work of this humble creature who knows nothing of the benefits he confers upon mankind, agriculture as we know it will be difficult, if not wholly impossible, is what Darwin said when he wrote his book on earthworms, because they're perceived to have major impacts on ecosystems. And if you ask farmers in terms of earthworms, are they useful in terms of different types of soil health measurements? Earthworm populations often come out top in terms of soil health indicators. And in terms of how people might use this information, if you ask people, does it influence your soil management practices? So often the feedback is yes, it is quite important, or a factor that could be taken into consideration. So people quite like earthworms, and there is science underpinning this sort of belief that earthworms are positive and good for the environment. It ranges from plant productivity to the burrowing network, which can be rooting and water infiltration, and also as a food source for wildlife. And from a food production perspective, earthworms are linked to an increase in plant production because they're mobilizing nutrients, particularly nitrogen, for plant uptake. And this picture here, you can see there are worm casts. And so that's what many earthworms are doing. They're feeding and increasing the availability of nutrients for plants. And in terms of how many earthworms are needed to do this, we have only around 30 species of earthworms in the country. It's not like insects, of which you can have hundreds, if not thousands. And of that, there are only maybe 6 or 7 species which are common in sort of garden and agricultural soils. And these are the most common ones you might spot. And this is the sort of biggest one. So this is a deep burrower. That's as big as they get. That's this one here. And then we've got the other sort of topsoil worms that you might find. And we've got surface dwelling worms, which live on the soil surface. They're red, and that's as big as they get. Then you've got topsoil worms. These are the most common ones. If you ever dig a hole, you're most likely to find this type because they feed on the soil, and they're ubiquitous. And finally, you've got the deep burrowers, which actually means reaching up. And this little video showing an earthworm being active at night, and it's foraging for leaf litter or plant litter to drag back to its burrow. So although they're deep burrowers, they actually spend quite a lot of time on the soil surface at night because they are litter feeding deep burrowing animals. And in terms of the earthworm effect, there was this nice meta-analysis done a few years ago to answer sort of key questions. How many earthworms do you need to see a benefit to plant productivity? And it was over 400 individuals per metre squared, which is about 16 per spadeful. And then is there a type of earthworm that you'd like to see have the most of, for example? And the answer was all earthworm types have an effect, but it's these deep burrowing, these anesic earthworms, which can have the biggest effect. And one of the reasons why that might be is that they form quite an extensive burrow network. They make permanent burrows in the soil, which can persist for maybe 50 or 60 years. And they can go quite deep. So they can go a metre or so down into the soil. And when you look at plant behaviour around that once you get beyond about 60 centimetres, almost all root channels are found in, almost all roots are found in old root channels, burrows or cracks. And here's a nice picture from a farmer's field that was sent to me. And you can see there's earthworm burrows here where the roots will be following. And in this is an example from America where they didn't have this species of earthworm. It's actually It's actually come from the UK. It's a non-native species, Lumicus terrestris, and you can see that the rooting depth here is around 150, which is very similar to the depth they found in the burrows. And in fields where these earthworms were absent, you can see the rooting depth was halved. And so this changes the ability of, for example, wheat being able to get access to water during the drier summer months. And it can improve, and that's why earthworms are sort of linked to improving plant health and ability to reach nutrients and things. So in summary, the burrowing behaviours, you've got the little surface type worms, which don't really burrow very much. They're living on the sort of under the litter layer. You've got the topsoil worms, which are in the topsoil, usually mostly up to the 20 centimetres. And finally, you have the deep burrowing worms who make these permanent vertical burrows in the soil. They can go to a lot of depth, but they're often very active around the surface. So what this means when you're looking at acoustics is that you don't need to go to sort of 2 meters, actually recording quite close to the surface. So the top 10 centimeters or so is fine to be able to detect earthworms linked to their burrowing behaviours. And finally, a food source for wildlife. That it's obviously part of its abundance, the number of earthworms that there are, but it's the earthworms are quite a quality food source, and so people have found, for example, with birds, that the more earthworms that are in the diet, the higher the reproductive success was for the chicks and for the birds, things like the song thrush. And this also extends to some of earthworm predators like the carabid beetles. And if you have a diet which includes earthworms, the beetles had the best growth and fertility outcomes compared to when beetles were only grown on a pest with a slug-only diet. And so earthworms sort of contribute to the broader quality of the habitat in that way. And there are many earthworm predators much more charismatic than looking at earthworms. You've got the moles and foxes, a range of songbirds, and then also things like the invasive flatworm and the larvae of some fly species predate on earthworms. And quality is important. It sort of adds value to many of these diets. And unfortunately, earthworms can carry some parasites and diseases, and the most famous ones are the black spot disease that can influence turkeys and lung issues from a parasite, which pigs can get. So earthworms are carriers for various diseases too. So it's not all good, but generally they're a good high protein food source for many organisms. And what do we know about the state of earthworm populations? Well, the answer is not much, because there's been no long-term monitoring of soil invertebrates, but people are worried that populations may have fallen over time, and because of the role that earthworms play, linked to their ability as a food resource, and also, that sort of thing, that actually we probably should record them because of their influence on soils and birds and general ecosystems. Why don't we monitor them? Well, I thought I'd give an example of something I did a few years ago. About 5 years ago, I was out monitoring for earthworms, and farmers kept saying to me, we'd really like to measure earthworms, what should we be looking for? And instead of sort of going down a biodiversity thing, the idea was quite simple, just to dig several holes, because you don't want all your earthworms, for example, in this corner. You'd like them to be widespread across your field to get those benefits to plant productivity, etc. So a couple of soil pits, maybe 5 or 10. You're checking you've got all the soil, the earthworm types. You've got the ones that burrow in the top, the deep burrowers, and the ones that are eating the litter. And then do you have plentiful worms? And plentiful was simply, do you have over 16 worms for spadeful, linked to this paper? And it was quite straightforward, and that's what I went around measuring. And it was possible, I set this up, and I measured a whole farm in a week or so, and just sort of compared it to those benchmarks. You see that most fields were not successful at passing the benchmark, but some could pass across a whole farm. So there's variability across farms depending on soil management and things. And it's quite popular. People from all over the place gave it a go. Most of every region in England and Scotland and around the world, all sorts of exotic places were sharing photos of their earthworms. So we're using the same size soil pits, the same number of replicates during the same week. And it, because I shared it on Twitter, it meant people from all over the place, for example, down in Australia and India and other places, people had a go at doing this, which was quite fun. And it became the AHDB How to Count Worms guide. So the idea was checking for this, checking you've got worms all the way across your field, quite straightforward. But there are some challenges to it. So although I asked scientists what they thought about this co-developed survey, because I went back and forth with farmers as to what works, which bits of the method were too tedious to do, that sort of thing. And the feedback was all right. You know, scientists generally thought it was okay. They'd recommend survey to farmers, perhaps to policymakers, and it might improve soil health. But the problem was that the trouble is with sort of citizen science type activities, the scientists themselves almost half rated the survey as not at all useful or slightly useful to scientists. And obviously it impacts the ability to publish such things or continue with such activities. And one of the biggest challenges was that without photo verification of the earthworms that farmers were identifying, people weren't very confident in the data they were producing. And that's a shame, but you know that's obviously a perception that people have that earthworm identification is very difficult to do. And so the problem is that you can't really scale this type of thing. So the traditional methods that we're using, it's very hard for other people to do that and for us to generate that information. What the survey did show was that surface and deep burrowing worms were often absent from the arable and horticultural fields that people were sampling. And you know, many of these fields are ploughed. And it is known that tilling soils affects earthworm populations and affects their community structure. And that deep burrowing earthworm, the anisic deep burrowing one, is highly sensitive to tillage. Its populations plummet, and surface dwellers are also very sensitive to tillage, and their populations become very low. And in this country, we tend to cultivate our soils quite intensively with ploughing. It has been declining over time due to costs and things, but it's still the dominant way of managing our soil habitats. And this little idea, what happens when you chop a worm in half is ploughing, chopping the worms in half. Just to solve that myth, you don't get two worms, the tail dies and the earthworm probably will, depending on where it's chopped. And a fun sort of fact is that moles actually bite earthworms up here to paralyze them. And then sort of have these massive food stores of earthworms, the sort of living earthworms that are paralysed in the soil, so hundreds of earthworms from their collection activities. So it's actually used, that may sort of be why people think you get more earthworms because they're still moving, but actually they're usually fatally damaged when you do things like that. But the key factor is that we haven't got this litter layer when you plough the soil. And 2 of the 3 ecological groups of earthworms feed on the litter layer and use it as a habitat. And I hope that I can show you this video if it works. You can see, if you go out at night, you can see this earthworm feeding on the surface litter. And you know, if we talk about a world with earthworms and a world without earthworms, and you put litter in both systems, you can see how active earthworms are in this nice video. So on one side you've got earthworms and litter feeders, and on the other side you've just got the microbial community feeding on the soils. So earthworms are ecosystem engineers. They have a really big impact on processes. And one of the challenges, if this was sort of turned over to a crop setting, is that all these sort of fungi and things that you're seeing here, all these sort of bacteria and whatnot, can cause plant diseases. And so by having an active litter community breaking down this material and feeding on these microorganisms, it can actually reduce plant diseases. And this underpinned a business case for that one earthworm, Lumbricus terrestris. And the idea was that because it's feeding on the litter layer and feeding on fusarium, it actually had an economic value estimated at $75 a hectare and could halve fungicide use. So that's important. So what we're doing towards building the acoustic side of analysis, because there's such potential here, is that we're building an acoustic library of earthworms. And so this has been done by Jess, who works in a sort of anechoic style recording studio we have at Warwick in the basement. And so we have adults, we're measuring weights in different standard soils and soil moisture contents. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear this because it's quite a quiet recording. I've maxed it out. Adjust your settings accordingly. So that probably do. So hopefully you're able to hear a crackling noise. If not, then it was a crackling type noise or rustling noise. We also have what I've called the sensor testing arena, which is a 60 plot area. I don't have any sounds from this, but we've got earthworm communities in mesocosms which we're feeding on leaf litter, and it's reasonably well shielded from the wind because you can see it's set below the ground, and we have lots of different soil properties and lots of replicates, and it's just a great place to be able to compare and sort of build, help with the development of the technology before going out to the field where you get more interferences. And finally, field recording archives, and sort of field recording already, might be a question when we're at such an early stage. The thing is, these are records that you've got now which can be reanalyzed as knowledge grows, and sort of capturing things now means you can explore biological changes over time. So that's just to sort of summarize what I've said so far, is that we can record deliberate and non-deliberate noises made by soil animals, and we can separate the geophysical, human and biological sounds. And biological sounds in soils are quite important. There are various evolutionary couplings such as the predator-prey or social parasites that are known. Traditional measurements like handsorting the soil don't really scale up. Even if you can get people to do them, there are some sort of challenges there with data quality perceptions. And so the activities that we're doing is we're creating an acoustic library to really improve the interpretive power. So single species in recording studios, looking at earthworm community mesocosms where you can test the different technologies for sensing them, and working on replicated field trials to really start capturing and recording information as an archive of change. And hopefully, we're supporting the technology developments by bakers, for example, the handheld units. And I hope that will be a nice intro for Carlos in a minute or so. So I will stop there.
Many thanks, Jackie. Has anybody got a quick question for Jackie before we move on? No, don't think so. Okay, so we'll hand over to Carlos.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I'll just see if I can get my presentation up and shared. Hopefully that's up on your screens and working okay. So I'm just going to sort of follow up Jackie's excellent introduction of the science and description of the work that's been going on there, and talk a little bit more about some of the applications of how soil acoustics might be used within agriculture, nature conservation, other settings. And I'll sort of introduce myself, I suppose, before I start, that I'm not a soil person, I'm not an agriculture person really. I'm a consultant ecologist, director of ecoacoustics at Baker Consultants, and work at Nottingham Trent Uni as a lecturer some of the time as well, but working closely on the current project with Jackie and co on the soil acoustic stuff. So I'm going to take a step back before I sort of leap in and just say that the current work we're doing on soil acoustics fits into a sort of wider ecosystem of soundscape monitoring, and that work has focused in two main areas since the 1970s and onwards, where we've been using sound recording devices to record whales and dolphins out in the ocean, and we've been doing the same on land, but for bats. And for those two species groups, using the sound they produce is the best and sometimes the only way we can detect the presence of them in their environments, because we can't see bats when they're flying around in the dark, and we can't see whales and dolphins when they're swimming around in the sea either. So picking up the sounds that they use to commute, find their food, and communicate with each other is a really good way to identify the presence of those species, work out what they're doing, which species are there, and what they're up to. That's been going on for a long time. I've been doing bat work myself for 25 years or more probably, and there's a couple of other areas that work has sort of developed into. In terms of the science, there's been quite a lot of work done on birds, although we've only really starting to use acoustic recording for birds within sort of commercial consultancy or conservation settings over the last couple of years. It can be done for above ground invertebrates, crickets and grasshoppers and those sorts of things. We can record sounds in freshwater systems, although that's hardly been done at all. The first ever paper looking at pond acoustics wasn't published until 2015, for example, only sort of 45 years after work had been done in the marine environment. And over the last 2, 3, maybe 5 years, we've started to delve into recording sounds within the soil as well. But the amount of work that's been done on that globally is very, very limited to 5 or 6 scientific papers published on the subject. So very new, lots to learn, but really good potential in terms of adding another tool to how we assess soil health or monitor the invertebrates within the soil. At the moment, there's no specialised equipment there's one piece of equipment that came out very recently that's specialised to record sound. So we are mostly recording with standard sound devices that are used for recording wildlife sounds or recording sound for film and TV and those sorts of things. And ourselves, Warwick, and a range of other people within the UK or elsewhere are still trying to identify the best tools and techniques for grabbing those sounds out of the soil and making sense of those, because it's not an easy environment to record sound in. But we've been doing that for a year or two now, and we have doing that within agricultural settings within the UK, in some conservation settings as well, working with people like the Environment Bank, who are working on biodiversity net gain plots, some conservation bodies, RSPB, for example, and we've also had some really good interest from wine producers in France who are interested in the terroir that they're growing their vines in, and interested in using new methods to try and understand what the soil biology is in those areas and how it might respond to changing management in those vineyards as well. Because we're working with Moet Hennessy, who, for example, have taken all pesticide and herbicide applications off their Champagne vineyards, are looking to reintroduce more traditional ways of working with the soil and using green cover below the vines, for example, and want to be able to track the impacts that might have on soil organic matter, soil moisture, and how that is can be revealed potentially through the interactions with the soil fauna as well. So Jackie's already showed some stridulation and talked about the sounds that we can produce, and as she was explaining, some of those, for example, that are produced by the beetle larvae are intentional stridulations, communication sounds they use either for speaking to each other or for scaring off predators potentially. Nobody knows quite sure at the moment on those. And I'm not sure whether you'll be able to hear these sounds, so I'm not going to play them for very long, but we can hear it. Sort of sound that we get from these stridulating insects. Similarly, we get different looking and different sounding patterns from the sounds we produce from worms and from other families of invertebrates as well. Those signals quite useful potentially, and there's a little bit of work that's focused mostly on pest species actually, rather than beneficial species or soil health or the general biodiversity. But some of the work that has been done in this graph on the left hand side has compared the number of sound events we're recording in a grain silo compared to the density of the insects that are pests within that stored wheat. And you can see that there's a good relationship between the overall levels of sound of recording, how many sound events, clicks there are per second or per minute, and the number of insects that are present. So the levels of sound are related to the levels of pest infestations potentially. And similarly, but out in the countryside, there's a paper this Brandhurst and Hubbard one on the right hand side, where they've mapped sound pulse rates across a field and compared that to excavated invertebrates, and there are some relationships there to where the invertebrates are and their densities and the amount of sound that's being produced in the area. So potentially, if we take repeated samples across a field or a landscape, we can use that sound information to try and understand better where those invertebrates are, which might be good invertebrates that are helping us out, or might be pest species that we might want to control. If you're interested in listening to some more sounds, there's some good work that's been done in Switzerland. A chap called Marcus Mader has this sounding soil website, and they have a number of samples that you can click on the website and zoom into particular locations across Switzerland and different habitats and listen to some of the sounds there. So if you've got a spare few minutes over lunchtime tomorrow, then look that one up. There's some interesting sounds. A slightly different way in which we can interpret the sounds of recording, rather than trying to identify the characteristic sounds from beetle species or from different worm functional groups or taxa, is to use an approach that's called an acoustic index, and this is ignores all of the species-specific sounds that are being created and just takes a single sound file and applies a bit of maths to it, a bit of an algorithm that analyzes how the sound varies from 1 second to the next, whether it's very dynamic over time, and how many different frequency bands. There's high-pitched noises, medium pitch, and low-pitched sounds. And the more sound that's going on and the more complex that soundscape is, yeah, you can apply and extract that, reduce it down to a single number. And if you do that for 1 minute files, yeah, recorded through the course of a day or over the course of weeks or months, or compared different areas, you can use these acoustic indices as a simple metric that is related to the sound complexity, which has been shown to relate to the biodiversity or the taxonomic complexity in an area, and can allow you to simply provide a sound proxy for biodiversity in a particular area. This is a spectrogram for underwater sound from a pond, where we've got plant photosynthesis going on, water boatmen and other invertebrates making their sounds, and you can see that how that varies from minute to minute, and we can see that where there's less activity going on, we get a low score. Where there's more activity going on, we get high scores, and we can track those numbers simply over the course of periods of time, or compare sites that have been recorded simultaneously. So this is the approach we're taking for a lot of the sort of sound analysis work at the moment within soil, because we don't know necessarily which invertebrate species are making which sounds, and so we have to take this broader scale approach to use acoustic index and use that as a metric for the sound that we're recording. If we do that, then we can track sounds between different sites and between different days, and also relate it to taxa richness. So the graph on the left-hand side is not work done by us, but done by Marcus Mader in Switzerland, where he's taken soil samples out, taken a simultaneous sound recording, and has then counted the number of taxa within that soil sample, and that seems to relate pretty well to the acoustic complexity index. As one goes up, the other goes up. At the top right, you can see a recording from my garden lawn, and you can see each data point is a single minute through the course of an afternoon into the evening, into the night, and you can see that as the soil warms up, the acoustic index, the level of sound activity recorded in the particular location, increases during the course of the day and then drops off at night time. So the acoustic complexity index in this relationship seems to be related to soil temperature. And then we can also try and figure out how these acoustic indices relate to different habitat types as well. And it seems to be the picture, although there needs to be lots more work done on this, that the more diverse the land use, the habitat above ground, the more diverse the invertebrate community might be, and that gives us higher acoustic index scores in the more diverse habitats. So we can relate the sound to overall soil fauna richness, it seems, and that is related to land use class or habitat type potentially. We've done some previous work in woodlands in Sheffield. Colleagues of ours, friends, have done work in the Amazon rainforest, and there's work that's been done in Switzerland where they have compared good woodland with bad woodland in Sheffield, burnt forest with unburnt forest in the Amazon, and organic versus non-organic land use in Switzerland, and has shown that we can detect differences between those three different habitat types, the good and bad versions of them, and that is related to the soundscapes we're recording in there, which is related to the invertebrate communities that are represented in those habitats as well. And much more work's needed on this to try and prove that within the UK agricultural setting and add to the overall understanding of this, and that's work that we're doing with Jackie, as she's just been describing over the last few years. That work's been done under the Farming Innovation Programme with DEFRA. As Jackie was saying already, we're recording sounds, we're developing hardware prototypes, databases of the sounds, and looking to develop an algorithm that will allow us to compare new recordings that are captured by farmers or other landowners out in the wild, compare that to our database and use that to inform them on what the soundscape within their soil plot is telling them about the soil health in their area. And we've had quite a lot of interest in the work we've been doing so far. We've already talked about the work we've been doing with Moet Hennessy. That's continuing and expanding into out of vineyards into horticulture within France. And we've had a lot of interest from growers, co-ops within the UK, research organisations who we're engaged with, and last year we had an activity at Chelsea Flower Show as well, where we were showing off to a lot of visitors during that that event as well. So really positive uptake in terms of what we're doing, with the overall aim that we can record sounds, we can interpret those, and we can use those to better inform how we manage soils and agriculture in general to try and promote soil health, soil resilience, and protect the biodiversity in our most important ecosystem. On that point, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.
Right, so we have quite a few questions in the chat.
Smashing.
So I think, so I think at least the first two or three are for Jackie. So the first one is from Gary, which is about earthworm behaviour. He says, for the anisic species, is it known how far they move each day? When soil is very wet, can they absorb oxygen from soil water rather than soil air so they do not drown?
Good question. So the anisic earthworm, that species is actually has a permanent burrow, so it just moves up and down, and it'll often sit in the top sort of 5 centimeters, so it doesn't move, or it doesn't sort of burrow very far. It just does an up and down burrow, and they're active at night. And when the soil is very wet, if it's flooded, earthworms will sort of just go off and use the water on the surface to try and migrate, which is why you might see the sort of strandlings on pavements and things recently. It's been very wet, so you can see quite a few there, so they try and move. And in a day they can move sort of 20 meters or so if it's wet enough and overnight, but they often end up stranded during the day. So that's what, so they don't tend to drown because they try and move away. Worms that don't move away tends to be the juveniles, because they're not as good at they're much smaller, and their burrowing or their ability to move quickly is much less, so they tend to drown. Yes.
Okay, Great. Then the next one is also, I think, a Jackie one. Are there any strictly worm-associated species of Lepidoptera native to the UK, Northern Europe?
Not that I know of.
That's a short answer.
Yeah.
Then there's a good one, ingenious one from Alex, which is there an option for mimicking a predator noise for cabbage stem flea beetle to keep them off crops of winter oilseed rape and veg crops, or is this not possible?
Yeah, that sounds very interesting for a project. I don't know,
Yeah.
Carl.
I can dip in on that a little bit, hopefully. For airborne sounds, for birds and bats, we can sometimes use similar, well, either predator sounds or same species sounds to attract or them, or make them fly away, or just confuse their senses. So you can blast ultrasound out to the speaker and confuse bats, and they won't really like going near there, for example. The thing with the invertebrates is that how you get the sound to them, because a lot of the sound reception that especially some beetles and other invertebrates pick up is vibration through a solid medium. So you'd need to be projecting the right sound into the plant that they're standing on, or the soil that they're in if they were in the soil. And those sounds, if they're in the soil or in the plant, are not going to travel very far. So I don't think, unless someone comes up with a great idea that I've not thought of, that'd be scalable across a field, really, because it tends to be quite localized to exactly where that thing is over a scale of centimeters. Yeah, getting the sound into the ears of the invertebrate would be quite tricky, I think, perhaps.
That's ingenious.
Yes. So some good thinking to how to do that, perhaps. But yeah, better man than me to answer that question, I think. Yeah.
So we have a couple of comments. So then we'll move down to the bottom. Is there any symbiotic relationship between earthworms and other worm species, or some beetles, dung beetles, etc.?
You can you can find they aggregate together in different areas of the soil sometimes. For example, where the terrestrius makes its middens, you often find other worm species associated with those middens in the soil. For example, if you have the deep burrowing earthworm, I often find it with the epigeic species, like leaning, sort of using the same burrow. Because the epigeic don't really burrow, so it seems interesting to keep finding them nestled together in the soil settings, as though they sort of share a relationship, but they also compete for the same food resource. So perhaps it's quite competitive.
Thank you. And another one. Is the technology science at a place where these techniques could be used reliably to monitor change over time, for example, on a woodland restoration site?
It's getting there, I think, and will be there fairly shortly. Yes, it depends what approach you would want to take. I think in terms of, it's easy enough to record the sound in a location if you have a bit of money available to buy the right equipment, whether you want to take a handheld approach to that and just do repeated sampling, or whether you want a sort of semi-permanent installation that you can stick there for a week at a time and to record that. So it's worth doing. And as Jackie was saying, the good thing about acoustic techniques is you are getting a raw recording from the sound file. So even if you're not quite sure how to interpret things yet, then it's still worth taking the sound recordings, because new machine learning tools and algorithms have been developed the whole time, for example, that allow us to do that. So for example, for birds, we've been able to record bird sound for a long time, but it's always been a quite long-winded and manual process to then identify which bird species in a recording. You have to sort of listen to it back, going back a couple of years, and say, yeah, that's a robin, that's a blackbird, and spend a lot of time manually reviewing that. In the last couple of years, there's new machine learning algorithms that can now, or BirdNet, that can now identify automatically 6,000 bird species. So you can just feed it a load of sound files, and it will tell you what bird species are present now with some level of confidence. And so if you're interested in doing some recording, then we can help you out in terms of the equipment that's needed and what to do, and you should certainly be able to monitor changes over time, and currently engaged with a project that's looking at how above ground and below ground acoustic monitoring might be used for biodiversity net gain, which requires 30 years of monitoring of sites that are included within there, and so any method that can take a standard sample from a site, whether that's sort of an aerial photo, satellite image, or an acoustic recording, and can compare that consistently year on year on year over a 30-year period, is really useful. So that's certainly something we're looking into and hoping to develop.
Thanks, Carlos. There was a follow-on to that question you were answering, so I don't know whether you partly covered that, which was presumably environmental conditions might affect this. So you mentioned warming soils over the day affecting activity, which makes sense. So would it need to be very clearly controlled to minimise variation?
Yes, controlled, or you need good metadata to record. So Jackie and I had discussions about this, that that earthworm activity tends to peak in the winter when the soils are quite wet, and as things dry out they are less active, while the soil invertebrates with legs tend to be more active probably in the summer months. So we can expect that there's going to be a sort of a whole shift in the soundscape that occurs on a seasonal basis, as well as through the course of the day. So if you're taking the recordings, you need to know where it's from, the physical conditions that go with that, time of day, time of year, and have an understanding of how those spatial and temporal parameters are going to affect the sound recording. So you need to have a bit of a mental model, or better off a statistical model, to allow you to sort that out a little bit. And that's one thing that, again, we're looking at with Jackie and Jess, who's on the call, I think, is looking at, for example, different soil types as well, how that affect the sound production and sound transmission as well.
Great. Then I think possibly this is the last question, since it's 5 o'clock. There was another one which you partly answered. Which season, time of year, is the earthworm population at its peak, or in which type of crop? I don't know whether Jackie's disappeared.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I just right. So earthworms are very active over when it wets up, so from sort of September through to March, and there are some species, or many species, which sort of essentially hibernate over summer. So they'll burrow to depth, they'll curl up in a ball, have a mucus lined chamber, and wait it out over the summer. So those black-headed worms, you might see lots of worm casts at the moment on the soil. That's made by the black-headed worm, and they're one of the species which will just essentially hibernate over summer. So you won't hear it because it's inactive. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right. So yes, we've got to 5 o'clock. So very many thanks, Jackie and Carlos. Really interesting. Learned quite a lot that I didn't know, which is great. And thank you to everyone for joining us for the session. And then, as I say, the next one will be towards the end of April. So thanks a lot, and maybe see you next time.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Take care.